In this video, you're going to learn about the biomechanical principles of training the abs, specifically the six-pack muscles. And the exercise that I'm going to use to teach this to you all is what you could call a GHD sit-up. Right, so I'll just start by letting this play so you all can kind of see the motion here. But from top down, we're going to talk about some principles here that you can apply across any ab training context, not just the one we're looking at here. So the first thing that you're going to notice about this setup, and that you should take note of in really any ab crunching setup, is that everything from here downward, right, in this case leftward on the screen, none of that is moving, right? My ankles are not moving, they're not changing position. My knees are not bending and they're not straightening. In my hips, and this is going to be a point of confusion, I think, so I want to spend some time here. My hips are also not changing in terms of their angle. So when I say hip, I mean hip joint, right, which is more specifically known as the femoral acetabular articulation. It's a fancy way to basically say ball and socket joint that sits kind of like here, okay? And hip motion, although it is very closely associated with spine motion, is not necessarily something that is of benefit when we're looking to train, in this case, these tissues right here. Why? Well, because when we're talking about the six-pack muscles, the six-pack muscles pull on the front side of the pelvis, which is roughly right here, and they're going to contract this way and from the rib cage downward this way. So all that they're doing is they're pulling this point and this point closer together, right? As any muscle would, but in this case, here are the points of origin and insertion, right? Or attachment points, put more simply. And so when we're training any muscle, what we want to do is we want to fix one of these 2 points, right? It's the same principle. It's the same reason that when you do a biceps curl, you don't want your arms flailing all over the place. You just want your elbow to be bending. So in the case of crunching, and specifically in the case of performing crunches which are top down, right? So my upper body is moving this way, my lower body, like a hanging leg raise would be the opposite, where my upper body is still. That would be a bottom up example, which is also perfectly fine to do, right? But in either case, we want to either fix this point or this point. Okay, so a long-winded way of saying we don't want anything from here this way to move, and it can be confusing for people because oftentimes the motion of the hip joint specifically and of the spine specifically look the same. So I'm going to provide another example of what hip motion would look like in just a second, but I want you all to just take note of what is occurring in this particular context that you're seeing now, which is just basically pure spine motion, right? So everything in terms of spine motion that is occurring here is occurring visually in what is represented as me arching, right? So me in this bottom position, I will draw this on here. Me arching in this bottom position looks like this, right? And then basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine everything from my chest going this way, sort of crunching down, sort of one segment at a time, right? All these things are essentially being folded down, folded down, folded down. If you can almost imagine like a dog taking a shit kind of a thing, that's almost what we want to think of. We want to think of just curling and uncurling our spine. So now let me show you all a version of what just basically a combination of hip and spine motion would look like. Okay, so if we look at this sort of similar situation, but now I've straightened my legs, right? My butt is basically farther this way toward the right side of the pad. Watch what's going to happen basically from, kind of right here to somewhere close to the top, right? What's going to happen is you're going to see that my spine, it'll bend a little bit, but what happens is this segment obviously stays rigid, but my spine will almost look like some kind of wooden plank, like a board, right? That's going to basically just pivot from here to here, almost as if it's like some kind of rigid lever, right? So you see the distinction there? Right, I'll play this in maybe a slower motion. So there's a little bit of bending occurring, obviously, but especially from here to here, right? This is all basically just hip motion. Okay, so if I pause here, and I'm going to draw this line on top. Boom, boom. What's basically happening is motion around this joint right here, the hip, is bringing the torso upward. Now, of course, your abs have to contract, right, in order for your torso not to just fall backward and arch, right? But the point remains the same, which is that if we really, really want to just be concentrating on the abs, not just in this context, but in any context, we want to fix the hip joint, move the spine. Fix the hip joint, move the spine. Now, this particular example I was filming for my exercise library as an exercise that is intentionally supposed to target both the hip flexors and the abs in a kind of blended sense, which is also perfectly fine as long as that is your goal. So if we go back to this video over here, hopefully now the distinction is actually going to start to be a little bit more clear, where again, everything from here down is fixed. And so I'm really just trying to basically smush my lower back into the pad. So to kind of transition now to cues and what to kind of focus on in any kind of crunching motion, right? One of the most important things is to be able to have something to actually push into if possible, right? So this pad and this GHD sit-up I love specifically because this pad is what we call a half moon shape. And because that pad is a half moon shape, and because my lower back in essence is also kind of a half moon of sorts, I can basically stick my lower back curve, what is known as a lordotic curve, or a sort of from the back side, it's concave. You can think of it that way. I'm basically sticking my lumbar spine on that directly so that my butt is falling off one side, and so that the rest of my spine, right, where the sort of meat of my lats are and everything else, falls to the other. And so this pad is basically exerting a force on me upward that way the whole time. And to initiate the crunch, I'm not really thinking about squeezing my abs. I'm thinking about almost smushing my lower back directly downward into the pad. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a really, really solid fulcrum for the motion. Fancy way of basically saying I'm intentionally coming into contact with this one part so that the rest of these segments can pivot upward as I described before. And if I again let this play, right, what you'll see is basically just a direct translation of me smushing my low back into the pad, which again results in that sort of curling upward and then forward. Now, the last thing that I'll comment on, because we've gone over the sort of setup principles and the execution principles now, both from a conceptual and a visual standpoint, I want to touch on this notion of what we call resistance profile, which is basically just terminology to describe where an exercise is heavier, just from a physics perspective, versus lighter. So when we look at the GHD sit-up specifically, right, and we look at, or we're trying to analyze, okay, where is this exercise harder or easier? And we identify that same pivot point of, okay, well, if the contact is basically here, everything on this side of that contact point is basically going to be the load, right? Because everything over here is anchored down by external objects, and it's also not moving. I'm not trying to move it, right? I'm trying to keep those things still, so those things are in place. So knowing that, right, when more of my body weight is suspended off of the pad this way, i.e. in the position that is paused right now, that is the point at which there's going to be maximal load. Why? Well, because if this is the kind of point of contact here, and I have all this distance of stuff that is suspended on what I would call this side of that axis, right? That is when as much of my body weight is distributed as far away from that point as possible. In technical terms, we could say that's the longest sort of moment of force. In other words, the longest moment arm. In other words, the longer wrench, right? Those are all just different ways of kind of saying a similar thing. But when I get to the top of this motion, watch what happens, right? So here is, again, that pivot point. Obviously, it hasn't moved. And now my body weight is basically just falling, that dotted line this far from that position. So I've literally just taken a position, which was, I'll just draw it on here, which was once suspended this far away. I've taken my body weight, suspended it that far away, away from that pivot point, and then I've moved it so close to the pivot point that now probably only 30 or 40% of that weight is actually acting on my abs, right? So this creates a situation where the top actually becomes much less challenging and the bottom becomes much more challenging. And so a lot of times what you'll notice, specifically in exercises like a rope crunch, for example, the bottom, the squeeze position is really disproportionately hard to the more stretched position. And so this is a way, because we're stronger in that more stretched or arched position, i.e. because we're stronger in this position right here as compared to the top position, adding more load where you are stronger from a muscular standpoint is a great way to make the exercise more uniformly challenging, i.e. every rep individually is going to be more stressful and more stimulating, stressful in the positive sense in this particular context, as compared to the alternative. Now, does that mean that there are no applications of the alternative, or that if you only have access to alternatives like that, that is just a waste of time and you're going to lose gains and you're going to shrivel into a prune? No, but it does mean that you might need to add some additional volume. It does mean that you might need to consider doing some kind of lengthened partial situation to extend your set to make it a little bit more stimulative on a per set basis. Whatever you have to do, just keep that in mind. So overall, those are the major principles. Again, fix everything. Make sure we're moving through the spine and not the hips. I hope that visual was helpful. And then wherever possible, try to make this more arched or stretched position a little bit heavier as compared to the short or the squeeze position.